Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics. Hi, this is Peter Purcell.
And Bill Imany.
How are you today?
I'm doing well, Peter. Hey, we're going to debunk another buzzword.
FP&A?
FP&A.
All right. So what does that stand for?
Well,
why is it important?
FP&A is basically an organization within a large corporation, even a medium-sized corporation, where they play a pivotal role. And FP&A stands for financial planning and analysis. And typically it's a team of people that are kind of the intelligence of the company or the brains of the company, for a lack of a better word.
But don't you also have it in smaller companies, Bill? You said large and medium. Don't you at least have somebody playing that role?
Well, typically, like if you're thinking of a smaller company, like for example, our company Trinergy, FP&A is kind of part of your and my job as co-CEOs of the company. But as organizations grow, you really need someone focused 100% on the financial numbers of the company, what's happening, what's going on, and providing that forward-looking view of the company, and always focused on where we're heading and looking at the future.
Okay. So when you start talking about that, let's kind of dive deep, a little bit deeper into that.
So typically when you look at organizations, you have your CFO team, and there's really two sides of the CFO team. There's the accounting side, which is keeping track of what's happening in the business and what's already happened. And then there's the other side, which is the FP&A side, which is keeping track of where is the organization going and looking forward. And there's also a little bit of a role within FP&A to support operations and sales and their decision-making as well. So if you think about where are you going and supporting decision-making, whether it's do we invest in a capital project? Do we conduct an acquisition? Do we move forward with a partnership with another company? Those type of decisions require some analytic insight. And so in a lot of cases, the people that are making those decisions are really, really good at what they do. So let's say we're talking about a capital investment, for example. The person who's making that capital investment is probably real good operationally and knows all about the intricacies of that capital investment, how that's going to work, and what it's going to actually do from a business perspective. But they rely on FP&A to provide that financial advice, to look at things objectively and say, okay, this is what it means from a cash flow perspective. This is how it impacts EBITDA. And this is how it impacts our earnings and our returns on our business.
Okay, so essentially it really is, if you were to use an analogy of driving a car, FP&A group is looking out the windshield kind of and helping you figure out where you want to go. And to really, beat a dead horse, there's a song out there that says, I can't tell you where I'm going, but I can tell you where I've been. So that's the accounting side. And then FP&A is telling you where you want to go.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think about you're driving your car and there's that little thing that says how many miles you have to go before empty.
That's a gas gauge. A shout out to my daughter. That's called a gas gauge.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go there with that. Or you might be looking at your there's other indicators in cars that tell you
how fast you're going, how fast you're actually burning the gas, which could be cash, right?
Or you're looking at your traffic and your Google Maps, and it shows you there's a
better path.
Yes,
and it's less expensive, less stop and go. Yeah.
Of course, I'm going to be truthful though. With Google, it sometimes tells you the worst. Sometimes it shows you a worse path. Like go this way, it's 10 minutes longer. I don't know why it does that, but that's an aside.
I don't know. I thought that was Apple Maps actually, but yeah, you're right. It probably is Google Maps. Okay, so we're talking about that, and within the organization, as you said, just to be clear, so FP&A is kind of on the finance side, and you do say that it does support operations as well. So this is not truly just a pure financial on the financial side.
Right,
There's
exactly.
Operations as well.
There's operations, but there's also sales as well. So if you think about, for example, pricing and contract negotiation. So when you put together a pricing agreement, and let's say you're a service company and you're putting together service contracts that essentially have pricing of labor and equipment and all those pieces, and they might have escalations in the pricing, they might have discounts, they might have certain kickers and change orders and that type of thing, putting that pricing model together and making sure that you're making the right decisions. Too many times organizations jump into pricing deals because it sounds like a good deal today, but it might not be from a bigger perspective. The FP&A team is actually providing that financial acumen to look at those and analytically and say, from a financial perspective, this is how it's going to impact EBITDA, how it's going to impact cash flow.
again, looking down the road and making sure that you're not just taking advantage of just a short term here and now. It's making sure that what we do today is not going to negatively impact us down the road.
Exactly. So the FP&A is almost like a partner with sales and with operations. And another way that FP&A supports the organization too is asking some of the harder questions that need to be asked. So, and sometimes a sales team in a quarterly business review will come together and they'll say, here's our pipeline, here's our opportunities. And they might ask some of the other questions like, okay, you got this big deal coming up. So have you talked to the decision makers? Who are the decision makers? Just kind of asking those questions to be able to really understand, are the forecasts the salespeople putting together realistic? I'll say provide that objectivity to something, because sometimes a sales organization will, hate to say it, sandbag their forecast in some cases.
Really?
Over forecast.
Whoa.
And so, and so they're providing that objective, I'll call it advisor to the CEO as well.
Okay. So as you're talking about this organization, it seems to have its fingers, across the company, forward-looking. So let's kind of talk about processes and best practices, because it sounds like a pretty complicated and could be a pretty complicated function. So what are some of your ideas there?
Well, first of all, let's talk about, we hear the word budgeting, we hear the word planning, and we hear the word forecasting. Let's define that before we jump into that. Budgeting is that annual exercise that everybody loves to do, where the company says, okay, give us your budget for next year. And then the company comes back and says, nope, that's not good enough, cut here. Basically, it turns into a number that nobody really believes, but they're held accountable for.
Right.
And I say that in jest, but historically, it's been a pain point for organizations, because at the top level, they have goals and expectations for the coming year, which might exceed operationally what each individual team believes they can achieve. So that the numbers don't add up. Mm-hmm. The IT department has a list of projects and initiatives they want to do and things they need to do. And we had a podcast earlier about technical debt. And that technical debt and reducing that might not be in the overall plan and vision of the company,
right,
but it's something IT needs to do. So they turn their budget in for $20 million to do all this stuff, and then they come back and say, nope, you only get 10. And they go, okay, well, how are we going to achieve our objectives? Budgeting negotiating process is a necessary, well, I don't even want to call it necessary evil, because sometimes I challenge organizations to even ask why they're doing that and what do they expect to achieve out of that. But there's some merit to capital budgeting, because you got to give your investors what you expect to spend for the following year and get that approved. But outside of that, the exercise of these detailed budgeting process tends to be a large waste of time and really doesn't provide that analytics the company needs. But it is something the company goes through, and typically the FP&A group will handle and oversee. That's budgeting, okay? So I just want to get that, kind of throw that off to the side there. And we're not going to talk too much about that today, but what we're going to talk about is planning and forecasting. And so when we talk about planning, really we're talking about the process of business planning that each, let's say, line of business or business unit or geography might go through, that then comes up and culminates into more of a long-range plan that says, based upon our business plan, we're going to go into these markets, we're going to do these things, and we're going to buy these companies, and we're going to go pursue these capital initiatives, and that planning process is more of a long-range planning process.
Okay, so for those of you that know me, this is way outside my sweet spot. But I'm going to ask you, the two people that are listening that know me, here's a stupid question, Bill. Why wouldn't I do my plan first and then build my budget to support that plan? Where it's like, okay, if this is the plan, why wouldn't I go back and say, okay, this is what it's going to take to achieve that plan and build my budget from there?
Well, that's actually not a stupid question. This is a good question, Peter. And it's always this chicken and the egg thing. Okay, what do I do first? First of all, planning is a continuous process. You don't just stop planning. What happens is you develop a business plan, and then as you're going through the year, you start looking at let's say the business plan includes some acquisition targets. And those acquisition targets may not have come to fruition,
or they were snapped up by somebody else. So
exactly.
you just can't. Yeah,
they're not. The opportunities aren't there, or maybe there's economic factors that impact your ability to make certain transactions and do certain things that are in your business plan. You're continuously updating that and looking at that from a forward-looking perspective, because the CEO, he's thinking 5 years out, or it should be anyway. He's thinking strategically, where are we going and how am I going to steer the ship? he wants to know all the time, where are we in relation to where we're supposed to be? Are we steering in the right direction?
enough.
So if I'm 1 degree off today, and as we, if you're a ship and you're 1 degree off,
Today, it may not be that big a deal, but 10 days from now, you're going to be running aground.
right?
Yeah, if you're trying to avoid an atoll or something like that,
Exactly.
something weird like that.
Yeah. So planning's continual, budget is typically annual. So I think you're right, though, Peter, in saying plan should come first, because it does. It's the first thing you do when you develop a business. You develop a business plan, right?
Right.
And then the budget comes out of that. So
Exactly. That was my question, because I've watched so many of our clients that, they like just take last year's budget, add 5%, and they're done. Or, they try to do zero-based budgeting, and it's just a nightmare, and they never get it done in time, and it seems like they're always budgeting. And not focusing on some of the other things.
Yeah, but you kind of knock zero-based budgeting. It's actually not a bad thing to do. The problem, the one you identified, is we're going to take last year and add 5%. Then you get into this whole thing of, we're getting to the end of the year, we better go ahead and spend all the money we have so we can add that 5%. And you get into that problem. A lot of government and universities get in that situation where they do that poor budgeting process.
Very, very efficient organizations, by the way, that
Yeah,
you just
right.
mentioned.
Government. Yeah. So, but looking at, I'll call it private companies out there, the zero-based budgeting concept is used quite a bit, where they say, look, I want you to start from scratch and look at, what do you basically need? I need these 5 people to run this department, and I need these computers to run the business, and let's start from a zero-based perspective as opposed to just building on to what we did last year. But the problem they get into with zero-based budgeting is just way too detailed. I want to know every single pen you're going to buy and roll of tape you're going to buy. It's more about keeping at a very high level and saying, look, workforce perspective, we believe that we're going to have to adjust salaries by this much at this high of a level, and build it out from there, as opposed to trying to get into the weeds.
Okay, fair enough. So that's how budgeting and planning kind of interacts, if you will.
Yeah, and then the critical part of FP&A organization is the forecasting process.
Okay.
And so what we mean by forecasting, it's that continuous process of looking out, let's say, monthly, quarterly, yearly, and typically it's the next 12 months or the next 18 months, depending upon the type of business that you're in. But looking forward and saying, okay, how are we going to do this month? How are we going to do this quarter? And how are we going to do for the rest of the year, and maybe even the following year? So typically you'll hear the word rolling forecast, where in January I'm going to forecast February through January of next year. And then in February I'm going to forecast February through February of next year. So it keeps rolling forward. And I'm going to add a month of forecast every time I finish a month. So that forecast is critical in that there's kind of 2 pieces to this. And people always ask the question of, what's the best way to forecast? And it really depends upon the business that you're in. Some organizations have an FP&A team that have some folks who know the business and understand it, and they're able to kind of forecast it as an individual, as a team. But largely, most organizations require input from the people in the field, operations, sales, who know what's happening, what deals are closing, what issues are happening in the field. Are there equipment problems? Are there customer issues that they need to be aware of, so that we can better forecast sales and margins?
So let me ask you this. In today's world, there's a whole lot of buzzwords around Chat GPT and AI and stuff like that. Is forecast a place where you might be able to leverage it? I mean, I know it's young and I know it's nascent, but when you start talking about market conditions and adding all this in, is that a place you can inject?
Well, there is, and that comes into bringing external information into the company and market factors, and using that to harvest information that's out there from a market conditions perspective. What are the expectations? What's happening? We don't advocate, putting your company information out there.
Yeah, no, from a security perspective, definitely
Not a good idea.
It's not an open loop kind of,
But you're going to keep your company data proprietary within what you do, but you might use that to assess what's out there and understand the trends, and maybe throw in, I'll call it, a series of scenarios and questions, and kind of see how that interacts with results and what you get back. But largely right now, the intelligence, because we're talking
is between the ears.
It's the intelligence between the analyst in the FP&A team and the people that are in the field. So if I've got a operational leader who truly understands plant operations and what are expectations, when certain factors occur from material costs, how does that impact my plant operations or inventories and that type of thing, being able to have that intelligence to know that when I know there's going to be a shortage, how's the plant going to scale down and be more efficient, or scale up when there's more demand, being able to have that intelligence in the operations, but also the intelligence within the individuals with that to discern the facts. People are not perfect. People do have biases.
Right, right.
And by the way, ChatGPT has bias.
Oh, yeah.
So there's bias out there. And the intelligence of the FP&A team to assess the bias in operations, in sales, and being able to come out with what's most likely going to happen. But here's the other important piece of forecasting is being able to look back and see how well you're forecasting. So, for example, if I said I'm going to achieve X% growth in sales or X% margin decline over the next 3 months, okay, did I do that? And be able to look back and learn from my prior mistakes, because someone might say, you know what, when plant manager, when you said you're going to scale back, you really only reduced by 4%, not 7%. And so next time you do the forecast, let's think about that.
Let's think about
but
that,
then
right.
let's understand why.
Yes.
What happened? And so really saying, well, you know what, we found out that our utility costs, we've got to keep the plant running at a base level, and they didn't go down as much. So we need to know that in the future that our utility costs aren't as flexible as we thought they were.
So it's almost a detailed variance analysis, if you will, but going to the root cause. And it's not necessarily a financial root cause. It's something operations did or didn't do, or an external factor. Utility costs could have gone up unexpectedly because price of natural gas or something. But you really need to get back to the root cause of why you were off.
You're exactly right. And so many times you'll hear people talk about, we had, some equipment was down in the plant, or we had to do some maintenance in the plant. So it cost us some extra money. Well, the question is why? And is this a trend? And by the way, is that piece of equipment in other plants that we need to then proactively go out and do some preventative maintenance on so we don't have this issue happen again? So it's having that thought process of saying, okay, what's the root cause? Oh, it's that piece of equipment is faulty. It's maybe there's a gasket that keeps breaking. We need to go and replace another place. So taking a proactive role in preventing the problems from happening again.
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. I mean, I'm not really sure how many people outside the finance organization would realize how helpful this particular activity would be, being driven, something that headquarters might, drive that would add value in operations.
I would argue with that a little bit. I think a lot of the operational people know this stuff. Like they know that. What I just said, if I said that to an ops guy, they would go, yeah, I know that. Yeah. The problem in organizations is those operational guys, the guy who's running that plant or running the maintenance group within that plant, he has no incentive or there's no process in the company for him to share lessons learned across the company.
Right. And so you say it so much better than me, Bill. That's kind of where I was going is the ops guy is going to be focused in his area on his plant. Like if you have a technician or a mechanic or whatever it is, right? But being able to use the FP&A group to kind of be able to share that kind of, or force the sharing of that information.
Enable the sharing.
Enable the sharing. Sorry.
That's a good question. So many times I've run into some cases in organizations where they're afraid to share something because maybe it was a hazard risk and they didn't want to publish that hazard risk. And you kind of ask the question of, well, why not? Well, we don't have a mechanism for doing that in the company. So helping with those processes and looking at that. And so maybe the FP&A group might say, hey, you know what? Y'all need an operation excellence focus to look across the company. And so that's something that the FP&A can help operations with.
Awesome. Well, so then we go to the last question, though, in all of this, Bill. Everybody's going to ask, okay, FP&A, got it. It's important. Or, hey, I knew what it was. It's really great that you're, reaffirming my knowledge of what it is. So from a systems perspective, tools, what do you use? Like Excel? I mean,
Yes.
what's the primary, how do you enable this from a tools perspective?
Well, so this is the question that I see the most in a lot of blogs that I'll get asked. We want to automate all this stuff and we don't like spreadsheets. We want to put it in a system. And the problem is people don't realize the cost involved in putting in a system. It sounds great. Everybody puts their information in. It's in a single database. It's shared and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, unless you're a sizable company with a lot of data and a lot of people who are involved in the process, and maybe there's a lot of scenarios that you're driving through. So I have to compare 50 scenarios in different use cases. Then there's a justification for a tool. So if you're thinking I've got all these scenarios I got to compare. I've got a lot of data that I'm trying to crunch through, and I've got a lot of people touching the system. Those are the three drivers that say I need to get maybe a system that
fair.
that these software companies provide. I'm not going to name any because I don't want to sound biased, but there's 100 of them out there. And if I named one of them, somebody would call me and go, "Why didn't you name mine?" But make sure those three components are there to justify it, because what people don't realize, the software company says, "Oh, for, I'll throw out a number, $50,000 you can have my software." But then, by the way, you want to do these scenarios and build these models, it's going to cost you another $200,000 to build the model. And then all of a sudden, $1 million later, you're sitting there going, "What did I spend my money on?" And then, by the way, the consultants leave, and then you got to hire a specialist who knows that software to keep it up and running. And then, by the way, that specialist who knows the software is the only person that knows it. And it becomes I don't want to say dead-end job, becomes a dead-end job for that individual, because they're kind of that system person. If they get promoted, they got to find somebody else to train to do that, and good luck with that. So those are the barriers. I'm not being negative about systems. It's just stuff that people need to look at. We help companies put it in, but really make sure there's a good business case for it before you jump in.
Okay. So anything else that you want to say in closing before I give out your email so that people can actually ask you what systems they should look at?
Yeah, my email is peter@trinergy.com.
Well, my email is bill@trinergy.com. So if you have questions, please reach out.
Or just go to our website and hit our Contact Us form. And you know what? The other thing is, if you enjoyed the podcast, please rate us and share it with your colleagues. We appreciate you guys listening.